So this is Danny Monteverde with WWL Eyewitness News, and the news tonight is about our local newspapers. You see the headline here on NOLA.com. The owners of the New Orleans Advocate announced today that they bought NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune. This is kind of a big deal. This has been kind of a newspaper war going on between the Advocate, based out of Baton Rouge, and the Times-Picayune and NOLA.com. Obviously, the bigger, much more known name in news around the country. And it's sort of in my story tonight, I'm calling it a David and Goliath fight. And this is one where David sort of won over Goliath. It was just a big battle for the Advocate to come in here in 2012, get a foothold, but they did. John Georges bought the paper, expanded it greatly, and now the Times-Picayune is now being bought by its rival, much smaller rival. So again, the big news tonight is that NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune are being bought by the Advocate. So what does this mean for readers? The first thing means it's when you get your paper in the morning, and about the next month or so, it probably will have a different name. It'll probably be the New Orleans Advocate and Times-Picayune. There's some New Orleanians of a certain age who might remember when the old afternoon States item merged with the Times-Picayune. That flag across the front page was the Times-Picayune, the States item. Going back even further, the Picayune is actually a composite of, I don't know the exact number of papers, but it started as the Picayune. Actually, here's a reprint of the first ever Picayune. This was January 25th, 1837. The Picayune eventually became the Daily Picayune and merged with a paper that at the time was the Times-Democrat. That paper itself was a merger of the Times and the Democrat. The Picayune eventually merged, as I said, with the Times-Democrat, became the Times-Picayune. Other purchases happened. The Picayune eventually, I think in 1923 or 1932, I have to check that, Picayune bought the afternoon States, and at one point it was called the Times-Picayune and New Orleans States on Sundays. Later on, this Picayune bought the item, and it had the New Orleans States and the New Orleans item, which became the States item. And then in 1980, the Picayune, which was the morning paper, and the States item, the old afternoon paper, printed 4 editions a day, merged into the Times-Picayune, the States item. And then here we are now in 2019 of all years with another merger. That's the latest chapter in the local print journalism story. And so again, the Picayune is, again, 1837. So it's not some new kid on the block. Again, the Advocate is kind of a new kid on the block coming into New Orleans, at least in 2012, when the Picayune's owners, the Newhouse family out of New York, they own a company called Advance Publications. They decided we're going to stop the daily publication, focus heavily on digital, because the reality of it is, this is where most of you are getting your news today, is here on the phone. Not as many people are getting the paper thrown anymore. The business model, in short, is broken. There's no real answer for it. And so that's why the Newhouse family decided to take this gamble on going heavily on the digital. They figured cut the losses on print, because it's expensive to think about the paper, ink, trucking, maintenance of presses. There was a lot of manual labor involved in putting out a newspaper, and so their thought was, well, let's get rid of that expense. We can kind of reinvest that into the news operation and meet people where they are, on their phones or on their computers. For as much as the business model is broken right now, though, there still is a lot of money in the hard copy newspaper. So there's no real answer yet to how this will eventually play out. In terms of business models, it even affects TV as well. There are fewer people who sit down at noon, 5, 6, or 10 to watch TV, and that's an issue. But anyway, let's take a look real quick at some of the headlines again. This is what the first ever copy of the Picayune looked like. Again, it's a reprint of that, but January 25th, 1837. This was the first ever Times-Picayune, or the Picayune, I'm sorry, before it merged with the Times-Democrat, which was a merger of the Times and the Democrat. As we said before, eventually you had the mergers back in 1967. The old Times-Picayune plant opened up. This was a special section. That's when they were owned by the same company, the Picayune and the States item. And you can see again, if you want to visualize the expense, of putting out a newspaper, just think of having to run, you know how much your electric bill goes up in the summer where you turn the AC on, or the heat in the winter. Imagine having to run presses for hours and hours at a time that are 3 blocks long. Just the electric bill on that alone, not to mention the paper, the ink, the manpower, the trucking, that sort of thing. So again, this was when the Picayune moved into its building right there along the interstate on Howard Avenue. Speaking of this business model, this actually, believe it or not, what you're looking at right here was an old sports section, but the whole front page was an ad for Homes, the old department store. Some of you might remember when those sort of things started to close, not just here, but elsewhere. But I mean, think about it. There used to be Homes, Godshaw's, Maison Blanche. A lot of those businesses closed, and when they went, the money went with them. But again, this was the sports section. And then eventually you open it up, and there's even more. Look at this advertisement for the cars here. More advertisement for Homes. Open it up again, then you finally get to your sports page. But again, a lot of the rest of that, and look at that, Buddy D, when he was writing for the Picayune right there, before he moved into radio and TV. But again, a lot of this was advertisements. This is what was paying the bills at the time. And really, that's, in that era, that's all you could do to get news. You didn't have your phone. You had basically your Times-Picayune or your States Item. You had some radio stations, and for a little while, not even many TV stations. You had Channel 4, Channel 6, Channel 8 for your news, and that was about it. So you were limited. So there was sort of a monopolistic business in that sense. I'll show you one thing real quick too. This was the headline, February 7th, 2010, day of the Super Bowl. Look at how thick the newspaper was. That was a Sunday. So look how thick the newspaper was there. By comparison, let me show you this real quick. I was out of town the other day and went to Fort Worth. It was in the Dallas area. This is the entire newspaper. Put them side by, it's hard to even hold up. That just shows you there's not enough advertising anymore to really support what there once was. But again, this was another of these memorable headlines. This was kind of interesting too. This was the other big news of the day. It's kind of hidden in plain sight. That was when Mitch Landrieu won his first term. That would have typically been the big front page headline, but how do you compete with that? So that's another of the big headlines that that we have in the history. This was actually, I'm an old Picayune reporter myself, and this was one of my first big headlines when I was a younger reporter. This was Bloody Halloween ends with 2 dead, 14 hurt, city reeling. It was just one of these rampages, you know, that kind of happened in the quarter, unfortunately. But another big headline, and you know, again, you've got the monuments. Of course, that was big news. There's some Jazz Fest, and this was actually, I think, the reason I kept these papers. Well, that was obviously for the monuments, but I think another reason I kept some of these papers was in a cost-saving measure a few years ago. The Picayune, they trimmed the width of the paper, and so the old paper used to be this size. Then they trimmed it off just a little bit to save what probably amounts to about an inch of newsprint. It's a lot of money that you save when you do that, and when you're trying to battle a business model that's just not what it was, you do what you can to save money. So again, the headline tonight is that the Advocate has bought NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune. There probably will be some job losses on the NOLA.com and Times-Picayune side. We don't have solid numbers on that yet. They say they will try to hire some people to move over there. But the human toll on this is there probably will be job losses on the NOLA.com, Times-Picayune side. For readers, again, you'll start seeing a new name on your paper, the New Orleans Advocate and Times-Picayune, something along those lines. They said they'll try to increase their suburban coverage, some of the Saints coverage, that sort of thing. But they admit, too, that they've got a lot of work to do on their end at the Advocate to try to get all of that figured out. So, hope you enjoyed that, and if you watch us, tune in at 10 tonight on Eyewitness News, and we'll have a deeper look at what happened today.